on those public servants and their families. How unfair, how mean-spirited, how wrong. These families are owed a paycheck, but they're left to wonder how they're going to pay the mortgage or the rent and all of their other bills. They're wondering what will happen to the good credit they have worked so hard to maintain over the years. They are innocent victims of the Trump shutdown, a shutdown he said he would cause 25 times, a shutdown he said he'd be proud to own. President Trump, are you proud to own a shutdown that's hurting so many innocent people? Did you realize that when you caused this? As government agencies remain shut down, American farmers and small businesses can't get the loans they desperately need. Tourism suffers as our national parks go neglected. Some families can't get a mortgage to buy a new home. The American people are suffering needlessly, because President Trump selfishly refuses to retreat from an intransigent, indefensible, and increasingly unpopular position. The Democratic House has passed legislation that received support from many of my Republican colleagues to reopen the government. In no way does that legislation preclude us from having a debate and hashing out compromise solutions on border security. We've done that before. We can continue to debate because, indeed, Democrats, Republicans, and the President all want stronger border security. We just sharply disagree about the best way of achieving it. Why not open the government while we continue to hash out our differences? I've asked that of President Trump. I said, give me one good reason why the shutdown should continue as we debate our differences on border security, which we all want. He could not give a single reason. We know the reason. He's leveraging, mercilessly leveraging millions of Americans who are caught in his irresponsible action and who are hurt by it. So let us open the government and continue to hash out our differences. That would be the responsible thing to do, and I believe Republican senators, many of them, know that. I urge my friend, Leader McConnell, to act now. Convince the President to accept legislation to reopen the government, and let's pass it here on the floor of the Senate. The vast majority of the Republican caucus has already supported it. What are we waiting for? Now, on another matter. This morning, it was reported that Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein intends to step down from his post at the Justice Department if the nominee for Attorney General, William Barr, is confirmed. It's a timely reminder of the swirling conflicts of interest and bias that surround nearly every Trump nominee to lead the Justice Department. Acting Attorney General Whitaker publicly and forcefully advocated for defunding and imposing severe limits on the special counsel's investigation, calling it, quote, a mere witch hunt, unquote. He has troubling conflicts of interest, including with a grand jury witness in the investigation. Not to mention the fact that he appears to have been involved in fraudulent business dealings before joining the Justice Department. The nominee to take his place, William Barr, is just as fatally conflicted a nominee when it comes to the special counsel. Last month, we learned that Mr. Barr sent the Justice Department an unsolicited memo criticizing the special counsel's investigation. Mr. Rosenstein's potential departure only heightens the stakes for Mr. Barr's nomination. From all accounts, Mr. Rosenstein has been an impartial actor at the head of the special counsel's investigation. Now President Trump is trying to replace folks like Mr. Rosenstein with conflicted loyalists like Matthew Whitaker and William Barr. The Senate, starting with the Judiciary Committee, should subject Mr. Barr's views to the strictest of scrutiny next week. And I still believe, after the revelations about Mr. Barr's unsolicited memo, President Trump ought to withdraw this nomination. Yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S1, which the clerk will now report.
Motion to proceed to consideration of S1, a bill to make improvements to certain defense and security assistance provisions and so forth and for other purposes.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The majority whip.
Is the Senate in a quorum call?
Yes.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be disposed of.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I think it's important that we just remind ourselves about what it takes to make a law here in Washington, D.C. It obviously takes passage of a bill by the House of Representatives, passage by the Senate, and a presidential signature. Obviously, we're in the middle of a sort of a, I guess you could say, fight right now between the executive branch, the president, and Democrats here in the House and the Senate, which normally would be resolved by the two sides sitting down and negotiating and coming to some sort of an agreement or a compromise. And that, frankly, is what is going to be necessary to resolve this current crisis that we're in, Mr. President. But the bottom line is that the Democrats here in the Congress, they have a majority in the House. It takes 60 votes, as we know, to do anything here in the Senate, which means it's going to take about somewhere on the order of 10 Senate Democrats in order to put a piece of legislation on the President's desk. There has to be a negotiation. There have to be two sides at the table. And the Democrats have made it very clear here in the Senate and in the House that they have no interest in negotiating with the President. Furthermore, they have determined that they're going to shut down all of the rest of the business that is being done here in the Senate simply because they do not want to provide funding for the border wall that has been requested by the President. And so that's the standoff that we are currently in the middle of. But I would remind our colleagues that as recently as last month, my friend, the Democrat leader, has said that in order for us to proceed and vote on anything in either chamber, we need to have a piece of legislation that the President has said that he would agree to sign, which again suggests that the way out of this is for the Democrats to come to the table and enter into a negotiation with the President about how to fund the border wall, how to deal with the issue of border security, and then to open up the government. That is the way that this ultimately gets resolved. And it seems to me, at least, from my observation so far, is that there has been no movement, zero movement on the part of the Democrats when it comes to trying to resolve the current situation. And so I would simply say that I agree with what the Democrat leader said as recently as December, and that is, in order for either chamber, the House or the Senate, to vote on a compromise piece of legislation, it needs to be a piece of legislation that the President of the United States has said he would sign. Each of these elements has to come together, and obviously each is very relevant in this conversation. You cannot have a law without a presidential signature. There are 535 members of Congress. There's only one President of the United States, only one person who can sign a bill into law. And so obviously the President is a critical player in this conversation. Of course, the Democrats, as I said, have the majority in the House of Representatives. It takes 60 votes to do anything in the Senate. I think we have a majority of senators who would vote today to provide the funding that's necessary to secure our borders, the funding that the President has requested. But it's going to take a number of Democrats, perhaps as many as 7 to 10 Democrats, in order for us to pass a bill in the Senate. And so the Democrats are very relevant in this conversation. They're not irrelevant. They have to be at the table. And normally a negotiation starts with the two sides saying, this is where I am, this is where I am, and figuring out how do we reach that common ground? How do we reach that middle and structure an agreement that could pass both the House and the Senate and receive a presidential signature? Well, that's not what's happening right now. I think we all know that. I think it's very clear that the Democrats are very dug in, have not moved a single inch off of their position from the time that this whole shutdown started. But I think there's a path forward. I'm hopeful that negotiations, discussions that will continue later today at the White House will lead us to a conclusion, to an outcome, and to a result that gets federal employees back to work to make sure that the government continues to function and run, but also addresses a critical and important priority for all of us as policymakers, and that is ensuring that we secure our borders in a way to protect the American people. Mr. President, I think it should go without saying that border security is a basic national security requirement. Countries have to secure their borders. They need to know who's coming into their country, and they need to be able to keep people who shouldn't be entering the country, like criminals and drug traffickers, out. Making sure that our borders are secure is one of our most essential responsibilities as members of Congress. It's a basic obligation, like making sure that our military is capable of defending our country. But while border security is always a national security imperative, it's particularly important right now because we have not only a security, but a humanitarian crisis at our border. Over the past year, illegal border crossing apprehensions have shot up by more than 30%. An average of 60,000 individuals try to cross our southern border illegally each month. This represents a serious security concern. Among those trying to cross our southern border are drug dealers, gang members, human traffickers, and other criminals. But this flood of attempted border crossings also represents a serious humanitarian concern. Individuals attempting the journey to come here illegally are vulnerable to exploitation, illness, and abuse. 1 out of every 3 women attempting the journey to the United States is sexually assaulted. A staggering 70% of individuals become victims of violence along the way. And illness and other medical issues are a serious problem. 50 migrants a day are referred for medical care, and Customs and Border Protection rescues 4,300 people in distress every single year. There is a direct way to stem this humanitarian crisis, and that is to promote legal immigration and discourage people from coming here illegally. And how do we discourage people from attempting to come here illegally? Well, I would argue, Mr. President, we enforce our immigration laws and prevent individuals from illegally crossing our borders. I've mentioned the dangerous individuals who can sneak across our porous borders and the humanitarian crisis that we face. But of course, there are even more dangers posed by the weaknesses in our border, both around barriers and through our ports of entry, like the illegal drugs that are pouring into the country. Every week in this country, 300 Americans die from heroin. 90% of the heroin supply, 90%, Mr. President, flows across our southern border. In 2017, opioids were involved in the deaths of almost 50,000 Americans. Roughly half or more of those deaths involve fentanyl. And a lot of that fentanyl is coming across our borders illegally. Federal agents have seen a 115% increase in the amount of fentanyl seized between ports of entry. One key part of addressing the opioid epidemic in our country is shutting down the flow of illegal drugs across our porous borders. Mr. President, Democrats used to understand the need for border security. In 2009, the Democrat leader here in the Senate said, and I quote, "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. Until the American people are convinced that we will stop future flows of illegal immigration, we will make no progress on dealing with the millions of illegal immigrants who are here now and on rationalizing our system of legal immigration. That's plain and simple and unavoidable." End quote. That, Mr. President, from the Democrat leader here in the Senate from 2009. In 2006, the Democrat leader and the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee voted for legislation to authorize a border fence. They were joined in their vote by then Senator Biden, then Senator Clinton, and then Senator Obama. 2013, every Senate Democrat supported legislation requiring the completion of a 700-mile fence along our southern border. This legislation would have provided $46 billion for border security and $8 billion specifically for a physical barrier. Nearly every Senate Democrat supported $25 billion in border security funding just last February. And I suspect that more than one Democrat still understands that we desperately need to improve security at our borders. But the Democrat leadership refuses to play ball. More than 2 weeks into this shutdown, they are still not willing to negotiate a solution that would secure our borders and reopen the government. Democrat leaders are willing to ignore the security and humanitarian crisis at the southern border simply because they don't like this president, because they're afraid to oppose the far left wing of their party. Mr. President, we need to end this partial shutdown, and we need to reopen the government. But the only way for that to happen is for Democrats to work with Republicans and the President to provide adequate funding for border security. Once they negotiate in good faith toward a serious agreement that the President will sign, the Senate will immediately take it up so that we can end this shutdown and take needed steps to bolster security at our borders. Mr. President, border security is not some issue that Republicans have somehow dreamed up. Securing our borders is a national security imperative, and both parties have a responsibility to make sure that our nation's borders are protected. And so, Mr. President, I hope that Democrats here in the Senate will remember their obligation to our nation's citizens and work with the President to secure our borders and reopen our government. And I would end where I started. And that is to say, in order for that to happen, Mr. President, there has to be an agreement. Both sides have to come to the table. Every one of the President, the House, the Senate, Democrats and Republicans are all relevant in this conversation because it takes all to accomplish a legislative result that will reopen our government, get federal employees back to work, and at the same time take the important steps that are necessary to secure our border. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, excuse me. I just note parenthetically that virtually every Republican and every Democrat in this body have voted for the bills that would open the government. Every single Democrat in this body is willing, if the Republican leader would bring those bills back up, would vote for them, and the government would open. So it's, I hope the Republican leader will allow the government to open. There are a lot of people who need to go back to work, and I'll speak about this later today, but I'm thinking when it's going to be 10 and 15 below zero in my home state at one point this week, that we have government contractors who would like to get back to work. Now, let me speak about a different matter. And this I'm going to speak about as an individual more than as a senator. My wife Marcel and I, as Catholics, have shared the concern of many, whether Catholics or not, with the continued revelation of often gross misconduct on the part of some in the clergy and in the hierarchy of our church. We've seen this throughout the United States, including in our own state of Vermont. I have rarely spoken about religious issues in my capacity as a senator, because I feel one's religion is private, certainly not political. However, I have spoken out about my concern and my dismay with what we've heard, and Marcel shares those concerns with me. I mention this because this past Sunday, at Mass at Holy Trinity Parish in the District of Columbia, we heard a sermon preached by Father Benjamin Holly, a member of the Jesuits. When he finished his sermon, I'll freely admit I wanted to stand up and applaud him. He spoke about what the church is finally doing in facing up to this. But then he spoke about how he was reacting and how one hopes we might react. But the reaction should be from the Pope straight down to every member of the clergy and every member of the laity. You know, except for some sermons preached by Marcel's brother, Father Claude Pomelo, I don't remember being so touched or affected by a sermon. I had not met Father Holly before, but after Mass, I spoke with him. And I asked him if I could have his permission to put his sermon into the congressional record. He agreed. And so, Mr. President, I ask consent that the homily by Father Benjamin Holly, S.J., of January 6, 2019, be included in the record at this time.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
from El Paso to Brownsville, Texas, my state shares a 1,200-mile border with Mexico. If you were daring enough to attempt to walk that entire stretch, you'd trek through deserts, across mountains, through cities, and probably end up getting a little wet in the Rio Grande River. You would meet folks who are proud of the strong bonds our country has with our southern neighbor. Many, of course, have relatives in both countries. You'd talk to sheriffs, police officers, Border Patrol agents, all who care deeply about protecting our communities. And undoubtedly, you'd end up eating some good Tex-Mex along the way. In my time in the Senate, I've had the opportunity to meet countless Texans who live and work along the southern border, and I seek their advice and counsel on what Congress ought to do, what the federal government ought to do to protect them and their communities. What they tell me is that Texans and the nation rely on the billions of dollars of legitimate trade that comes across the ports of entry with Mexico. But with the growing volume of crossing our borders and the persistent staff shortages for the Customs and Border Protection, they want to make sure that there are no security gaps that can be exploited by criminals or slow down the legal movement of goods. That's a concern I share, and I continue to advocate for additional improvements in our ports of entry to protect this vital lifeline for our economy as well as our security. But just as these communities care deeply about the economic benefits of our shared border, they care deeply, of course, about their own safety and security. They believe that both can peacefully coexist, and so do I. During my visits, I've witnessed some of the horrific treatment that migrants receive at the hands of the criminals, including those that smuggle them. The truth is, these criminal organizations that move people and drugs and contraband across our border, they exploit our porous border and care nothing for human life. It's a commodity. It's the way they make money. They care nothing for the people they hurt. So they wring another dollar out of someone else's misery on a daily basis. And it's a high-volume business, too, and incredibly lucrative. I've seen the stash houses with windows lined with tinfoil inside a veritable cesspool that makes you want to gag or lose what you had for lunch. This is where the human smugglers cram large groups of illegal immigrants in unimaginable conditions while awaiting their transit to the interior of the United States. I've seen their log books where they record their corrupt transactions, correlating real live human beings with their value in dollars and cents. I've talked to Border Patrol who've discovered tractor trailers full of people attempting to enter our country, some of whom never complete their journey because they die from exposure or are smothered to death in the crammed quarters. And in Brooks County, where the Falfurrias checkpoint of the Border Patrol is located about 50 miles north of the border, I've seen unmarked graves of the migrants who were trying to cross vast swaths of South Texas in the August heat in order to bypass the Border Patrol checkpoint, but then who were left to die by the smugglers. Their graves are marked only with identities like skull case or unknown female. Border security is not immoral, Mr. President, as Speaker Pelosi has shamefully claimed, but refusing to act in the face of evil is immoral. It's clear there's a crisis, as it is clear that it's our responsibility to restore safety and security and order. In my wildest dreams, I never would have imagined we would be debating if we should secure our borders, as we apparently are now. That's something we should all agree on. Instead, we should be focused on how to secure our borders and how to do it in a smart, responsible way. In my experience and learning from the experts, they tell me that's no one-size-fits-all solution. You can imagine in a 1,200-mile border with just Texas and Mexico, with the variety of topography and geography, that one-size-fits-all does not work. What works best in the Rio Grande Valley doesn't necessarily work in an urban environment like El Paso, with Juarez just right across the International Bridge. We need to customize solutions that meet the specific need rather than trying to dictate from here in Washington, thousands of miles away, a solution that solves nothing. We need to look at border security as a combination of three things. Physical infrastructure. Yes, that includes barriers, walls, fences, vehicle barriers in appropriate locations, but it also includes technology, radar, ground sensors, drones, aerostats. This is a layered approach that provides flexibility for the experts on the ground to determine what is best for each sector, what is best for each part of our immense border, and implement the changes necessary to achieve desired results. As I said, in many areas, the landscape and location means that physical barriers may not be needed, may not be practical. In rural areas, technology, sensor technology or cameras may be sufficient, but we know we need additional boots on the ground too, because it's not enough to put a barrier in place or have a radar or a ground sensor in place if you don't have the Border Patrol to show up and detain people that they discover trying to make their way illegally into the United States or bringing drugs into the United States. So some combination of these three elements, I think, is always going to be needed, no matter where you're talking about. I'm proud of the work we've done here in the Senate, generally speaking, and I know that when we work together, we can do a lot of good. But logic and experience should tell us we shouldn't be the ones deciding how every inch of our southern border is secured. I don't claim to be an expert, although I have gone to school on the topic. Spent a lot of time talking to those people who are experts and learning from them. And I believe we need to let those experts drive the decision-making process on the right combination of resources needed to achieve operational control of the border. Unfortunately, our Democratic colleagues' refusal to invest in real border security has landed us in a partial government shutdown, resulting in 800,000 federal workers who on Friday won't get a paycheck. That's unnecessary. And they are, unfortunately, collateral damage to a political game which we should not be playing. I know many of these 800,000 federal workers are already anxious about how they will make a car payment, or how they'll pay their mortgage or their rent, or how they'll put food on the table. That's completely unnecessary, this shutdown. I'm afraid this debate on border security, of course, is not really a debate about border security at all. It's a way for congressional Democrats to take a stand against a president they oppose, while putting border communities at risk and sending the men and women who protect them to work without pay. This battle's gone on too long, and I can only hope that Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer show some leadership rather than continue to take the low road. This shouldn't be about winning a partisan fight. It should be about protecting our citizens and stemming the tide of illegal immigration, drugs, and contraband entering our country. If there was ever a time, now is a time for common sense to prevail and end this senseless shutdown. Mr. President, on another matter, I want to share a few words about an American hero I had the pleasure to get to know, Mr. Richard Arvin Overton. Richard's story began more than a century ago on May the 11th, 1906 in Bastrop County, Texas. Throughout his young life, Richard held a variety of jobs: landscaping, picking cotton, working at a furniture store, and building homes. In 1940, Richard enlisted in the United States Army, and he began his military service at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. Serving with the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion, an all-black unit, one of his first stops was Pearl Harbor, the day after what we now know as the West Loch disaster. In an interview in 2016, Richard recalled that day, seeing the water turn red from the blood of his brothers, saying, "I didn't look the same, but I got out all right." This is only the first stop in Richard's tour, which later led him into the Pacific Theater. His service included stops in Guam, Palau, and Iwo Jima, where he witnessed firsthand some of the darkest days in our country's modern history. When the war ended, Richard returned to Texas and built a home on Hamilton Avenue. He originally re-entered the furniture business and then began working for the State Treasury Department. At the sprite age of 85, Richard Overton decided to retire. In 2013, the 107-year-old Richard Overton made his first trip to Washington, D.C. with an honor flight. He was able to witness the memorial built to honor his service and his comrades who died in battle, a sight that brought him to tears. While his military service alone deserves our praise, that's not the only thing that brought Richard national attention. His comments about the keys to his longevity and his long life, in particular his daily routine, made Richard an internet sensation. His penchant for enjoying coffee with whiskey and 12 cigars a day won hearts and caused all of us to question the secret to his long life. Richard also enjoyed a bowl of ice cream every night, always butter pecan. He called this the Overton diet and welcomed anyone interested to give it a shot. Richard used his newfound fame to continue life as he always had, but with more fans eager to stop by and say hello while he was sitting on the front porch. He continued to live in the same house he built after the war, although the street name has now been changed to carry his name, Richard Overton Avenue. I first met Richard in 2013, and I remember the day my wife and I, Sandy, met him at his home in Austin. And I was taken aback to learn he had just gotten through mowing his lawn that morning, 107 years old and still mowing his lawn. Sadly, on December the 27th, 2018, the story of this American hero came to an end. At the ripe old age of 112 years, Richard passed away, leaving a host of cousins and extended family members. Yesterday, I introduced a resolution with my colleague, Senator Cruz, to honor this great man and his military service and his enduring legacy. Our country's lost a true patriot. Our state has lost a legend, and our community has lost a dear friend. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Wyoming,
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, new year begins, and it brings with us new challenges, new opportunities, and new faces to the 116th Congress. I want to welcome the 9 freshman senators, Senator Blackburn of Tennessee, Mike Braun of Indiana, Senator Kramer of North Dakota, Josh Hawley of Missouri, Martha McSally of Arizona, Mitt Romney of Utah, Jackie Rosen of Nevada, Rick Scott of Florida, and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona. Their talent, their hard work brought them all here. And now we have an expanded Senate Republican majority, a majority to build on the progress that we made in the 115th Congress. Albeit we're still short of the 60 votes needed to pass most pieces of legislation, we have a group of people committed to the values of our party and our country and working together to find solutions for the nation. Mr. President, during the swearing in last week, as I was sworn into to the Senate, my 96-year-old mother joined us, and she attended it, enjoyed it, and watches the opening every day for the Pledge of Allegiance and for the prayer from Reverend Black, and looks to that as a sign of our nation moving forward. You know, from the time I was a little boy, she would always say, "This is the most important year of your life." She started when I was very young, and I think that her lesson remains today. For me and for all of us, this is the most important year of our lives, for ourselves, for our nation, for the world. And she would say, what you do this year makes a big difference for the future, so make sure you do it right. Well, we're now at a point of divided government, the Democrats controlling the House, the Republicans the Senate, and we need to work together and do it right on behalf of the American people. I think we have some immediate tasks. One is to secure the southern border, and the other is to fund the government. Now, these goals aren't mutually exclusive. We can and we must do both. And the key to breaking the current impasse is for both parties to work together. President Trump, I believe, is absolutely right to insist on border wall funding. I think he's right to insist on it before agreeing to sign spending legislation to end the shutdown, and he spoke passionately and I thought convincingly about it last evening. If the southern border were a patient, and I practiced medicine for 24 years in Wyoming, if the southern border were a patient admitted to the hospital, it would be listed in critical condition. All Americans want a healthy immigration system that secures the border, that enforces the law, and that keeps families together. The problem, of course, is the rise in illegal entrants, terrorists, drug smugglers, human traffickers, the Mexican drug cartel, all exploiting our porous border with Mexico. The Customs and Border Protection Commissioner has called the situation, quote, border security and humanitarian crisis. That's what we're dealing with, a border security and humanitarian crisis. So here are the numbers from the Department of Homeland Security. Currently, 16,000 Border Patrol agents and 8,100 military troops guard the southern border. The National Guard has been deployed there continuously since 2006. Still, illegal border crossings increased dramatically from 2017 to 2018. In this past year, the year just ended, 396,000 people were stopped at the border, including 3,700 suspected terrorists, 800 gang members. Of the border's 1,950 miles, a physical barrier today protects about 650 miles. Border Patrol areas with enhanced or expanded barriers have been successful. They have seen a 90% decrease in illegal traffic. That's why the President wants to proceed with additional barriers, physical barriers, to protect the border. Well, look, there's a huge improvement due to the wall. Clearly, walls work, barriers work. So I ask, why is Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, prolonging the shutdown by denying critical funding? Well, she has called the wall immoral. I would say what's immoral is refusing to provide for the safety and the security of the American people by providing border security. Border security policymaking has always been bipartisan, but not now, it seems. The Pelosi plan to end the partial shutdown isn't serious policy. It's political posturing. And as I say, partial government shutdown because 75% of the government continues to be funded. The Speaker's proposal includes billions in wasteful spending while ignoring the crisis at the border. The President has promised to veto what she is proposing, but instead of negotiating, the Speaker is basically play acting. Mr. President, what's needed is an agreement between the President, the Democratic leaders in the House and the Senate that can pass the House, secure at least 60 votes in the Senate, and then be signed into law. As President Trump said in January 4th letter to Congress, a nation that fails to control its borders cannot fulfill its basic obligations to its citizens: physical safety, economic safety, essential public services, and the uniform protection of our laws. Mr. President, we cannot afford to play politics with the border. I think that we should listen to the advice that my mother continues to give me, that this is the most important year of your life. It's important for this body, for this institution, and for this nation. Let's start 2019 and do it in the right way by passing common sense legislation that does secure the border, that does reopen the government, and that protects the American people. Let's work together to make this the most important year, the start of a better future for all Americans. Mr. President, I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
From Connecticut.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are.
Ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to share with the body today my very short New Year's wish list. And it's very short because 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all the same. We need to open the government. We need to reopen the 1/4 of the federal government that is shut down today. We need to start acting like adults. We need to start doing the job that we were sent here to do because our nation's security is at stake. Kids' health is at stake. Families' economic security is at stake. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers all across the country are furloughed as we speak, including over 1,000 in Connecticut. But that's not the extent of the damage. When you start having folks at airport security not be able to show up for their jobs because they have to work somewhere else in order to put food on the table, when you start creating questions about whether food stamps are going to go out or Section 8 vouchers are going to get paid, when you can't have the Department of Agriculture functioning to help our farmers, you're starting to affect a whole lot of people. You're starting to drag down the entire economy. And so my hope, my wish is that we will reopen the federal government. The fact of the matter is, this happens every now and again. Occasionally, somebody makes a demand, something that they can't get through the normal political process, and they say if they don't get that demand, they're going to shut down the government. Every time I've been through one of these, it's the party making the demand that eventually relents, because we tend to all agree that that's not a way, that's not the proper way in order to try to get what you want in the United States government. Senator Cruz and others shut down the government for 2 weeks because they wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Eventually they relented. This time it's President Trump who couldn't get Congress to approve $5 billion for his wall in the budget, so he decided to shut down the government. This is not how we should conduct a debate about legitimate public policy issues, right? The future of the American healthcare system was a legitimate public policy issue, as is the security of our borders. But we shouldn't be having the discussion amidst a government shutdown, trying to use our nation's security and all of these federal workers and the work that they do as hostages to try to achieve a political result. And of course, we all were on the same page just a few weeks ago. This body voted unanimously to open the federal government. And now Senator McConnell says that that piece of legislation that all of us voted for in December can't pass. Well, what changed? What changed in each one of your states that causes so many members of this body to now say that they cannot vote for a continuing resolution that you all voted for back in December? Well, we know what's changed. The only thing that has changed is that the president has decided that he won't sign it. But that's not how the Constitution works, right? The Constitution doesn't make the United States Senate subservient to the president. The United States Constitution certainly doesn't make the president's party subservient to him. No one here has to follow the orders of President Trump, especially when he's doing something that's bad for the nation. We could bring up that same bill that reopens the government, at least temporarily. We could all vote the same way that we did back in December. We could send that bill to the House of Representatives and admit that the president shouldn't dictate our votes. Just because his position changed doesn't mean that Senate Republicans' position should have changed. Let's reopen the government so that then we can have a discussion about the question of immigration law and border security, because I'm more than willing to have it. Okay, I didn't exactly tell the truth. I do have 2 other wishes beyond reopening the government, but they're connected to my primary wish. My second wish is that the president would stop making up things as he proceeds through this debate. The worst of his lies was the idea that there were 4,000 known or suspected terrorists that came across our southern border. Right? That was a number proffered by the press secretary at the White House. It has been repeated in various ways, shapes, and forms by the president's allies. Of course, we now know that there have not been 4,000 suspected terrorists that have come across the southern border. There have been 6 since the beginning of this year. That's 6 people who are on a terrorist watch list who weren't U.S. citizens. You know how many people who fit that description came across the northern border in the first 6 months of this year? 41. 41. So if you really care about the security of this country, if your primary reason for getting up every morning is to make sure that terrorists don't get into this country, then we should be putting up a wall with Canada, not a wall with Mexico. The second fiction is that all of these drugs coming to the United States are crossing the U.S.-Mexican border at places where there isn't a wall. That's not true either. That's not true either. The vast majority of illegal products that come into this country come through ports of entry. Now, we should all talk about why that is and what we can do to beef up protections, but putting up a wall along the treacherous portions of the Rio Grande are not going to stop smugglers who right now can find lots of other ways to get their goods into the United States. So I want to make sure that when we have this debate, we are having a fact-based debate. And my second wish in this new year is that the president and his allies would just start telling the truth. Would just start telling the truth. And the truth is that there is not a new security crisis at the southern border. Right? Illegal crossings have been coming down since 2000. Right? The terrorists, the people that are on the terrorist watch list that occasionally do try to come into this country, they are predominantly trying to get in through Canada, not through Mexico. And so I want to talk about facts. Here's my last wish. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are reopen the government. But if I had 6 and 7, it would be that the president start talking about the real facts. And the other would be this. Let's not get into this very dangerous conversation about trying to do an end around on the political process with a national emergency. And I guess I'm talking to my Republican colleagues here. I get it that I often have some of the sharpest words for this president, but I hope that we can come together on the idea that declaring a national emergency because you can't get what you want through the political process is a really bad precedent to set. It is true there are a whole bunch of national emergencies that have been declared. But none of the circumstances of those national emergencies, none of the powers that were utilized in those national emergencies compare to what the president is reportedly considering. If the president is really talking about declaring a national emergency on our border, despite the fact that there's no set of facts that suggests what's happening on our border is fundamentally different today than what was happening a year ago or 10 years ago. If the president is really contemplating by executive order reprogramming billions of dollars that this Congress set aside for military construction projects to a border wall, that is a Pandora's box, which once opened cannot be shut again. That is a genie escaping out of a bottle that will not be put back. I said in jest last night that if President Trump can use a national emergency declaration to build a border wall, what would stop a Democratic president from declaring a health care emergency and passing and declaring a national emergency to create a single-payer health care system in this country? I wouldn't advise a Democratic president do that. But I'm not sure what the precedent would be if President Trump, having not been able to get Congress and the American public to get behind a border wall with Mexico that nobody really wants, declares a national emergency and builds it anyway. What would then stop any future president from doing the same thing on a host of other policy areas? Really, what would stop a president from declaring a healthcare national emergency because he or she can't get their legislation passed through the United States Senate and reordering our insurance markets, our Medicare and our Medicaid program to cure that national emergency, simply shifting money around from place to place? I don't think that this is an avenue that the federal government should go down, because there will be a Democratic president someday. And if you can just declare a national emergency and move billions of dollars around because you can't get your way in Congress, that is a horse once out of the barn that's not coming back. So that's my wish list. Open the government, open the government, open the government, open the government. Pass the bills that we passed back in December. Don't let the president dictate your votes. Let your constituents dictate your votes. Hope the president and the White House start telling the truth about what's really happening with border security. And I hope this nonsense about declaring a national emergency goes away. And I hope it goes away in part because Republicans in this body recognize the really dangerous precedent that that sets for this country. And they recommend publicly and privately to the president that he shudder that idea. We could reopen the government today. If Senator McConnell came down here and decided to put a continuing resolution before this body, said that it's the right thing to do for the country, it would pass with flying colors. If Senator McConnell exercised that kind of leadership that he has shown in previous shutdowns, it would pass with flying colors. We all know it would. We all know it would. I'm sure there'd be a handful of Republicans who maybe just got elected with President Trump's support who might not support it, but it would pass, just like it passed 3 weeks ago. And it would likely pass the House of Representatives by a veto-proof margin as well, once the signal was given by Senate Republicans that the adults needed to step up and reopen the government. So this whole crisis can be over tonight. It can be over tonight if there is some leadership shown by Senate Republicans. And why spend all this time trying to control this body? Why spend millions of dollars trying to run for office to become the majority party in the United States Senate if you're not willing to step up at a moment of crisis and lead the country through it? It's still possible. And I hope, as my New Year's wish, that it gets done sooner rather than later. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum?
We are.
Mr. President, I ask that we vitiate the quorum.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that privileges of the floor be granted to the following member of my staff, Heidi Steele, fellow in my office, during the pendency of the 116th Congress.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on U.S. national defense. In the last couple of years, we have made tremendous progress in strengthening our military and have effectively realigned our global posture and strategy. Under the new National Defense Strategy, the United States has rightfully recognized the return to great power competition, where our priorities have shifted from low-intensity conflict to posturing against peer and near-peer adversaries. Over the last 17 years of combat in the Middle East, U.S. dominance and deterrence against great power competitors has diminished. Meanwhile, nations like China and Russia have undertaken extraordinary military modernization efforts while engaging in unprecedented and destabilizing aggression. We have seen Russian intrusions in cyberspace, the illegal annexation of Crimea, information attacks on Western democratic institutions, and the spread of lies, half-truths, and slander in order to sow division and chaos between the United States and our partners. These gray zone activities, which are actions below the level that would provoke an armed conflict, have gone mainly unchecked by the United States, which has set a troubling precedent and only served to encourage further provocation. From China, we see these gray zone techniques manifested in their land reclamation in the South China Sea, the construction of their first foreign military installation in Djibouti, and the continuing theft of intellectual property and trade secrets in critical security areas. They have also greatly undermined our supply chain through the Made in China 2025 initiative, which seeks to ensure that the United States and others remain reliant on the Chinese industrial base. Above all, the U.S. is threatened by Russia and China's advances in emerging technology. This includes hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, space capabilities, quantum computing, and directed energy. Without significant resources and focus, we will lose our technological superiority in these very areas, and both U.S. national security and the global order will be in serious jeopardy. Building off of our successes from the last 2 years, Congress and the executive branch must remain committed to investing in research, development, and rapid acquisition, and the deployment of capabilities that provide for deterrence in line with the threats of the 21st century. Just as we rose to the challenge in the 2 world wars, the Cold War, and following the attacks on September 11th, 2001, we must once again evaluate our current posture and chart a course that best protects our national security and our interests. While the National Defense Strategy correctly prioritizes a return to great power competition, we still have great national security threats in the low-intensity domain, particularly in the Middle East and in North Africa. The success of our missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria are important. And in Africa, we can include Africa. They can be seen in our ability to prevent extremist groups from projecting attacks into the U.S. homeland through the heroic and dedicated service of our men and women in uniform. We have put unyielding pressure on foreign terrorists, and in turn, we have prevented another massive attack like we saw on 9/11. While we have seen tremendous battlefield success against groups like the Islamic State, counterterrorism and stability operations require a sustained commitment of presence and resources in order to consolidate gains and promote good governance and the rule of law. In the absence of the latter, ungoverned spaces quickly transform into breeding grounds for terror groups. And that is why we are in Iraq. That is why we are in Afghanistan. And that is why we should remain in Syria. We must do that until our objectives are met. Balancing our approach towards both low and high intensity threats will require us to rely on our allies and our partners more than we have had to rely on them in the past decades, as we have a limited supply of resources for our national defense. However, if we are able to leverage the resources of our friends, we will assume less risk as we move to more resources towards countering great power threats. And likewise, as we seek to bolster our defense posture towards peer competitors, we will greatly benefit from increased contributions and commitments from our allies and our partners. That means insisting that our treaty allies contribute their fair share to the international security burden, and also ensuring that our allies and partners are investing in weapons systems and military platforms that interoperate with ours while effectively deterring our common adversaries. We cannot and should not abandon those who share our values of democracy and freedom, but rather work with them to increase defense contributions and build necessary capabilities and capacities. Unlike Russia and China, our network of allies and friends who have stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the defense and freedom of democratic values are a source of great strength, as well as an integral part of promoting global security. Mr. President, I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to once again acknowledge the most detrimental adversary of our national defense, and that is poor fiscal policy. As then Secretary Mattis stated when he announced the National Defense Strategy, continuing resolutions and sequestration have hindered our security more than any foe. These wasteful applications of taxpayer dollars prevent long-term planning, stymie research and development, delay critical procurement, and prevent necessary training and readiness investments. Mr. President, what we do in this chamber has consequences that reverberate far beyond Washington. When we fail to do our job, we put our war fighters at higher risk and cripple our strategic posture, ultimately endangering our national security. That is why I have come to the floor today to urge bipartisanship and collaboration amongst both houses of Congress on defense spending policy. The political climate of today will assuredly prevent progress in some areas of Congress's work, but I encourage my colleagues to set those differences aside when we consider policies and appropriations for our national defense. We have a lot of work ahead in order to protect our security and interests, but I am confident that we can come together to solve these issues of critical importance. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Missouri.
You know, as our colleague from Iowa just pointed out, these problems not only need to be solved, but they are solvable. At the core of the debate we're having right now is obviously border security. Everybody says they're for border security, but to have a different view of what that means. I want to start by saying, Mr. President, I fully support the President's call for a more secure border, and frankly, I think physical barriers are part of that. We have thought that for a long time. They work. People who now are opposed to them have often been for them. In fact, a generation ago, we began improving and expanding barriers in a few areas along the southern border, and in every instance, they've made a difference. In 1992, the U.S. government built a wall in the San Diego sector of the border, the San Diego sector of Border and Customs Protection. The number of people caught crossing that barrier, that border, decreased by 95% when the barrier was erected. Now, the border is not exactly like the bank. You don't have to have the level of security that nobody can ever get through in any time under any circumstances. But if you have a solution that solves 95% of the problem, that may be about all we can afford to do in terms of solving the problem that way. But that barrier, that wall, that fence south of San Diego did just exactly that. And so the next year, we built a wall in El Paso, Texas, at that part of the border, and that was a decrease of 95% as well. 2000, we built a wall at the Tucson, Arizona sector, and apprehensions there dropped 90%. So we got a 90% solution or a 95% solution. That's reasonable to the American people who think that the job of the federal government, and they are right in this, one of the jobs of the federal government is to secure its border. You wouldn't have to look very far in troubled parts of the world to find a story about Lebanon or some other country to read that sentence that says the border is not, Lebanon, this government is not truly functional because they don't have control over their own borders. It is a reasonable expectation of government. 2000, as I said, we built a wall at Tucson. And you can call this whatever you want to. If you're offended by when I say wall or fence, you say whatever you want to say. It has the same impact. I've been to the border a number of times. I've walked along the barriers that are there. I've been on one side of the fence, the two sides of a fence with a patrolled roadway in between. Looked pretty effective to me, and the numbers indicate it was effective. So when we, in 2005, added a wall in Yukon, in the Yuma part of the Arizona sector, apprehensions went down another 95%. So we got President Clinton, President Bush, Bush 43, Bush 41, all were part of thinking barriers worked, and the Congress was too. This was not an issue as to whether or not a wall works where a wall works until President Trump, as a candidate, began to talk about building a wall. They make a big difference in the areas where we've tried them in the past. Now, the president's often said in recent days that the wall doesn't necessarily work everywhere, and I fully agree with that. The wall, you couldn't afford the wall everywhere, and if you did have the wall everywhere, you'd have to monitor it with some remote monitoring device anyway, because there's a lot of the border that there just aren't people there, there's not access there. Doesn't mean you can't monitor that, doesn't mean you can't have that kind of a wall erected, and we need to do that. In November, there were nearly 52,000 people that were caught trying to sneak across the border. Now, you can act like that's not a very big problem unless you've ever lived in a community of, say, 52,000 people, and then you realize that's a lot of people. And in 1 month alone, they were coming across the southwest border. According to the Department of Homeland Security, nearly 17,000 criminals were apprehended trying to get into the country last year. That's about half of the population of the capital city of Missouri, 17,000 people trying to get in with a criminal record just last year. We've seen a 50% increase in gang members being caught trying to come into the country illegally, and a 73% increase in the seizures of fentanyl. You know, one of the things we do in the Labor, Health, and Human Services area that I work in and appropriate for and work for appropriate opioid response is trying to figure out how we can get fentanyl out of this system. How can we get something out of the system that is deadly for a significant number of the people that turn to that as they get addicted to painkillers? Well, if 73% of the fentanyl seizures, if they're up 73% over where they were the year before, something needs to be done. We clearly need to secure our borders. Now, I support the immigration system. I am a proponent of legal immigration. I think how we meet the workforce needs of the country, how we deal with the fact that we have people who are here who aren't legal, who have otherwise not gotten in trouble in the country. About half of them came across the border. About half of them came in some other way and just decided, this is a pretty doggone good place and I want to stay here and I'm afraid to go home because I might not get back. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with this in a way that we meet our workforce needs, that the skill needs of the country are met? And skill needs can be unskilled people, that we don't have people willing to do some unskilled jobs, and highly skilled people, that we don't have enough people doing their jobs in an economy that's growing faster than the economy's grown in a long time. The economic numbers in some cases are better than they've been in 50 years, and in most cases are better than they've been in at least a decade. Now, you know, every part of the border doesn't need to be secured the same way, but the border needs to be secured. Our friends on the other side, in what has been a pretty impressive show of party unity, have just decided that they want to reject the options of how we secure the border. People who have voted to build and maintain almost 700 miles of border fencing have suddenly decided that another 50 miles or another 2 miles is immoral. Now, talk about selective immorality, that it's okay to have 700 miles of fence, but it's not okay to have 702 miles of fence. A very interesting place, it seems to me, to draw the line. Our friends on the other side have rejected attempts to fix the way we deal with children who are brought across the border or come across on their own. You know, there are 48,000 children right now that the U.S. government is doing their best to take care of, I hope, and want to insist that we do that, who came across the border on their own. Another 2,600 or so came across the border with an adult. More often than not, that adult was their parent, but not always. We've got 50,000 children that came across the border, and no response to any ideas that the administration brings up, no positive response from the other side as to how to deal with that. They've rejected adding beds at detention centers for people who are caught crossing the border illegally. Now, why would you do that? Why would you not want to have additional space for people who are in custody for illegal behavior? I suppose because it just becomes so critically important that people just be released on their own recognizance to come back at a later time. Some of our friends on the other side, in fact, have called for the complete abolition of the U.S. Customs and immigration enforcement efforts. At a very time when these are some of the most stressed people working on the behalf of the country for the federal government, we have people on the other side saying we should just eliminate border enforcement. Had a bill introduced in this chamber last year that every member of the minority supported. It was essentially, when you read it closely, and I'm not at all sure they all did,
because I don't believe this is the position they all had. When you read it closely, it was a clear open borders bill. There was no way anybody was likely to be apprehended crossing the border except just to told, you know, you're here illegally now, come back sometime and we'll see if we can figure out what to do. We are for protecting people who are uniquely at risk in the country that they come from. Asylum's an important thing. No country in the history of the world has been any more open than we've been to allow people to come here legally, to have people come here who legally seek asylum. But the truth is, there is no asylum granted just because you're from a poor country or from a dangerous country. And so most of the people that come saying they seek asylum don't get it. Maybe that's why most of them don't show up in court, because they know that their argument, they'd rather be here than where they were from, but their argument will never work in court for most of them, and that is clearly understood. We are going to have a lot better opportunity to solve the problems we need to solve in regarding the border if people have confidence that the government has done a reasonable job of securing that border. I don't think anybody expects the border in a big country like ours to be so impenetrable that nobody could ever get in under any circumstances. I think they do expect, when you've found the 90 or 95% solution that appeared up until now to be affordable and widely supported, when you've found the 90% solution, people do expect that at the very least you'd apply the 90% standard to the responsibility of the government to secure its borders. So whether it's trying to figure out what we need in our workforce to have a continued growing and vibrant economy, or it's trying to figure out what do we do about people who came here and decided to stay, whether they came here across the border or in some other way, but stayed beyond the time they were supposed to be here or got here without going through the normal process. Those are going to be much easier to come to a conclusion on if people know that the government has done its job to get the border under an acceptable and anticipated level of security from what we would expect to have from a country as strong and vibrant as ours. And particularly for people who were brought here and grew up here, this is an 80% issue in the Congress and in the country. Virtually nobody thinks kids who grew up here and didn't get in trouble, in significant trouble, shouldn't be allowed to live in the country they grew up in. And frankly, we need them. We need young people entering the workforce. We need people who are, in almost all cases, highly motivated. I talked to a university president just this week that said, these kids are the kids who over and over again set the standard. They're the kids who over and over again prove why we want them to be in our country. These problems are much more solvable if we'll just deal with the one fundamental problem of controlling our borders, of having immigration laws that work. I hope, Madam President, as you mentioned earlier today, that we can get to this conclusion and get to this conclusion quickly. This is obviously a place where we need to come together. Not only does the government need to function, but this is just an issue we need to solve. And I guarantee you this issue, all of these related issues will be more easily solved if we secure the border. And no president has ever had the credibility that this president will have if he says to the American people, I have met my commitment, the border is secure, we're now continuing to work to be sure that the court systems work, that we have protected those people who protect us on the border. There's great credibility here if the president is willing to get to a place that he can say that. And I think his efforts to secure the border are significant steps toward allowing us to solve the other problems that we need to solve, and we need to solve sooner rather than later. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from
If
Missouri.
we vitiate the quorum call, I think there's an adjournment
Without
motion
objection.
coming up.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.